Good evening to or good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to our fourth and last webinar on the geopolitics of ICT standardization. Today with a focus on US. This was a little bit a risky initiative because of two reasons. We kind of had the US election with a open outcome, and on the one hand, on the other hand, we are a little bit late today in Europe. Therefore, probably some of the European interested audience is already not anymore in the office. But nevertheless, I'm quite happy to have a series of very distinguished guests and experts on the agenda. Therefore, I will kind of skip my intro and give mainly our ladies from the US the floor. First, I'm quite happy to have Maria Knake and Jayne Morrow, former NIST, representing NIST and presenting the United States Standardization Strategy, which has been published in May 23, more or less a little bit more than a year after the European Standardization Strategy. And therefore, I'm quite keen to see what happened so far, and especially now it's about implementing some of the initiatives, and therefore I'm quite curious to see what NIST has kind of ideas for implementing the strategy. And then we have Mary Saunders from ANSI. She's a Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Public Policy. And ANSI is one of the major player regarding standardization in the US, and also being, I think, very important for implementing at least some parts of the US National Standardization Strategy. And finally, we have Justus, who is with the Northwestern University Center on Law, Business, and Economics, the standardization expert in the US, having a little bit more an academic view on the US activities in standardization and what policy implications he derives from a more academic perspective. And therefore, I skip my lecture or my brief talk. I will kind of do that if there's some time left, but I'm more interested in the presentations and the interesting discussions. And therefore, I give the floor to Maria and Jayne, talking about the US strategy.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to share my screen, and I will get started here. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
All right. Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. All right. Well, my name is Maria Knake. I am the acting group lead for the Standards and Conformity Assessment Services group within the Standards Coordination Office at NIST. Dr. Jayne Morrow joins me today as well. Jayne is the CEO of Quantum Core at Montana State University, but previously she formed as the senior advisor to the director and the interim standards executive at NIST. And so she is here to support and add to my comments today as needed. So thank you, Jayne, for being here. The U.S. Government National Standards Strategy, as Knut mentioned, was released by the White House in May of 2023. And it was developed for several reasons: to promote U.S. leadership globally in critical and emerging technologies by maintaining active and strategic engagement in international standards development, to leverage private sector innovation, building on the U.S. tradition of a market-driven, private sector-led approach to standardization, reinforcing the U.S.'s bottom-up approach and encouraging broad participation by U.S. stakeholders in standards development, and also to ensure coordination efforts between the U.S. government and the private sector to strengthen our economic security and ensure that critical emerging technologies meet our safety, interoperability, and security needs. And then finally, to support pre-standardization efforts in early stage development. One of the things that the strategy recognizes is that the national interest in emerging areas of standardization demands a new level of coordination, and that effort's going to require the development of new ways for the public and private sector to work together to advance our national competitiveness. The U.S. standard system is unique compared to that of other countries. It's built on a voluntary, decentralized, and private sector-led standards development process. And this approach has served the U.S. quite well. It enables stakeholders to discuss technical standards in an open forum, building consensus, and then submit the standards for final adoption, not by the U.S. government, but by a standards body. It's important to note that the U.S. government strategy is intended to support and complement ANSI's U.S. standards strategy with a focus specifically on critical and emerging technologies. The strategy reinforces that the U.S. government will work proactively with industry and standards developers to address the international implications of standards in support of national priorities, but specifically in critical and emerging technology areas. There are several critical emerging technology areas that are specifically called out in the strategy, as seen here on this slide. Then there are also specific CET applications that are of interest to our global economy and national security that are called out as well. The strategy contains 4 lines of effort, including investment, participation, workforce, and integrity and inclusivity. It reinforces the support of the private sector-led, open consensus-based international standards system and strengthens the rules-based process of relevant organizations. It also reinforces the U.S. government's responsibility to coordinate policy that prevents and reduces barriers to U.S. private sector participation and influence in international standards development. When NIST was tapped to lead the implementation efforts for the strategy, our approach started with a comprehensive landscape scan. One of the things that NIST director, Dr. Lori Locasio, felt was that it's really important that because our system is private sector led, that we listen very closely to our private sector stakeholders and gather as much information as we can from them. So we started with this comprehensive landscape scan in which we collected information from our stakeholders regarding our standards system. This information was then synthesized into an implementation roadmap. That roadmap was published in 2024, and we are currently in the process of implementing the roadmap. So we are really in the implementation phase right now, and for that reason, there's still a lot of work to be done. So in order to gather stakeholder input, we had 3 primary approaches that we took. First, we opened a request for information, or an RFI, that closed in December 2023. And we used this to broadly collect as much feedback as we could from several different stakeholders regarding the strategy and advice for the U.S. government on how best to implement it. We also had several listening sessions across the country and participated in a lot of other stakeholder events, approximately 150 events that we spoke about the strategy, collected feedback, and gathered input from stakeholders. And then we also established a subcommittee under the NIST Visiting Committee on Advanced Technology, or the VCAT for short. This is NIST's federal advisory group. This subcommittee put together a robust list of recommendations for NIST on the implementation of the strategy as well. I also wanted to mention that we had a cooperative agreement with ANSI, and Mary may speak to this a little bit in her part of the discussion today. But it was a cooperative agreement to explore standards-driven public-private partnerships. This happened earlier in 2024, and it was a project that was executed in order to inform and implement the implementation of the U.S. government national standards strategy. The project explored the role of public-private partnerships to enable and accelerate standards development. And through literature and interviews, ANSI identified and reported on the objectives, convening mechanisms, and lessons learned from past and existing public-private partnerships. ANSI also hosted 2 brainstorming sessions to explore the use of public-private partnerships in CETs. You can find the information on this project and a really extensive report that was published by ANSI. There's a link to it on standards.gov and then also on ANSI's website as well. So we took all this information, all of the results from this landscape scan, and we have a few key findings that we reported. So first, public-private sector coordination. working effectively in consortia and communities of practice to develop and promote adoption of sector-specific standards, including those critical to national security, public safety, security, health, and environmental resilience. Also, better coordination in the federal government, coordinate pre-standardization R&D investments, other activities related to proposals, leadership opportunities, and engagements to support the integrity of the international standards system, and also to promote the World Trade Organization's technical barriers to trade committee principles. In addition, foreign government coordination, working with like-minded partners and allies to ensure that CE standards are developed and support U.S. interests to advocate for a commitment to free and fair market competition. We also heard a lot about standard funding opportunities, especially targeting academia and small and medium-sized enterprises. We heard quite a bit about standards education and the need to enhance educational efforts and leverage academia as a critical partner to increasing engagement and training of the next generation of standards professionals. And then also we heard about standards communication, explaining the role of U.S. government and academia in our system, and providing awareness for senior leaders in industry, government, academia to understand the value of our standard system and with regards to competitiveness and innovation. And then we also heard quite a bit about real and perceived barriers, including the need to reduce visa wait times, identifying and eliminate knowledge gaps between U.S. policymakers and technical program leaders, and to just facilitate better information sharing, education, and awareness, especially with underrepresented stakeholders. This time I'm going to pause quickly, and I just want to ask Jayne if you have anything that you'd like to add or augment based on what I've shared.
Thank you, Maria. I think your remarks are really thorough summary of what was heard throughout the listening sessions and stakeholder engagements. And just for situational awareness, I'm no longer affiliated with NIST, but also had the opportunity to help host some of these conversations with my colleagues here, Mary Saunders from ANSI and Maria Knake and others from NIST over the last several years. And I think one of the areas of additional sort of observation that we had throughout these conversations really is in that bottom line of opportunity to clarify standards engagement for a more diverse audience. There are a lot of ways in which civil society, academia, and others, even just public engagement in standards development is needed. And part of this is a reflection of the shift in landscape in the utility of technical standards and technical standards bodies. The convening power of technical standards bodies is shifting. And so one of the observations that we heard from stakeholders and could clearly see within data throughout the standard system, and I think we'll hear more about toward the end of our conversation today, is that there really is a change in standards body engagement and more public, what I would call public policy or national security safety policy happening in technical standards bodies as a result of the way that technologies are being deployed. And so the more engagement from civil society, academia, and others in these technical bodies will really enhance the opportunity and broaden that diversity of thought and perspective that contributes to what we expect a technology to be able to do for our societies. And so I think that was a very interesting observation and clearly shaping some of this conversation through this forum and others, and really interested to hear what comes out of our conversation today regarding those observations, and really looking forward to continued coordination with the private sector, the federal government, foreign governments, academic institutions, and across the private sector. So thank you, Maria. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you, Jayne. I really appreciate that. And I think that some of the points that you brought up will certainly come up in our discussions again today, or I certainly hope that they do. To kind of build on what Jayne said, all this information that we collected went through this process where we really had to churn with it and spend some time with it and figure out, well, what can the U.S. government do based on all this information that we've gathered and the key findings that came out of the RFI, the listening sessions, and our other engagements. And all of those things culminated into an implementation roadmap. The roadmap is broken down into 2 key areas. There are immediate actions that the government will take now, as well as some sustained actions for some sustained implementation outcomes. You can read the roadmap by going to www.standards.gov. You'll hear me say that website a few times today. Just wanted to mention, I'm not going to go into great detail on all of the outcomes here. This is still very much a work in progress. NIST is coordinating across US government to work on implementation. We're working on some of the immediate actions and then also planning for some of the actions for sustained implementation outcomes as well. NIST and the US government both recognize that standards development activities are central to the success of our US innovation system, and you will see that message pretty strongly stated in the roadmap. And it's important that we work across US government and with industry to find new ways to strong and visibly coordinate our work in bilateral, regional, international forums to promote consistent application of internationally recognized principles for standardization. And then it's also recognized that NIST should work closely with industry, government, and academic partners to expand the understanding of voluntary consensus standards development processes and how each entity can get involved early and often in the process. And then lastly, I wanted to mention that NIST requires a robust R&D investment to underpin standards proposals and improve the quality of standards contributions. So I encourage you to go to standards.gov and take a look at the roadmap more closely. It's quite detailed, and there's just a lot of information in there, and a lot of work went into its development. I wanted to just briefly, before I pass things on, just share some of the things that the NIST is currently doing towards implementation of the roadmap. So one of the first things that we've done is established a Standardization Center of Excellence. The goal of this Standardization Center of Excellence is to support US engagement in international standardization for critical and emerging technologies that are essential to economic competitiveness and national security. So it's very much in line with the implementation roadmap. There are a few key areas. There are really 4 pillars of the Standardization Center of Excellence. The first is pre-standardization engagement to encourage and ensure private sector participation, especially in those underrepresented groups, small and medium-sized enterprises, making sure that they stay engaged in international standardization efforts or get involved and know how to get involved. Workforce capacity building to create a pipeline of professionals, especially early to mid-career professionals who can engage and lead international standards development activities. There's also a collaborative pilot program with NIST. That pilot will be used to explore ways to accelerate the development of industry-driven standards wherever they're needed for selected CET areas. And then finally, it also includes the creation of a information and data sharing hub to serve as a central source for all stakeholders involved in standardization, with information and tools that are tailored specifically to the needs and priorities of a particular CET. My apologies. So the winner of this award is ASTM International. It's a cooperative agreement program. So this program actually will kick off the contract kicks off in January. So we haven't actually started yet. But in addition to $3 million of funding going to ASTM every year, ASTM has several partners that they've identified that they are bringing into this effort to marshal global expertise in standards development, standards education and workforce development, and standards optimization. So those organizations, their partners include ANSI, A3, which is the Association for Advancing Automation, ASME, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, IEEE, UL Standards and Engagement, CSA Group, and then there are other organizations that are offering support roles as well, including Accurus and Nexite Group. So we're looking forward to this 5-year engagement. It's going to be very exciting, and hopefully we'll have more information to share after the kickoff in January. So again, I would check out standards.gov for updates on that as the plans fully develop and form. We haven't really engaged with ASTM too much yet because the agreement doesn't start till January. So more information to come shortly. NIST also held a NIST Standards Forum, the first of its kind, on September 11th. This was held on NIST's Gaithersburg campus. It was an in-person event, but it was also streamed and is recorded if anyone is interested in going back to watch it. The purpose of this event was to communicate the commitment of NIST and its key partners to advance global standardization as a strategic priority for the United States. NIST staff and stakeholders in the private sector and other federal agencies attended to learn how NIST is advancing critical and emerging technologies through public-private partnerships and ways that other organizations and agencies can participate in this important activity. The forum featured NIST's director, Dr. Lori Locasio, who delivered a morning keynote. And then we also had an afternoon keynote from Gordon Gillerman, who's NIST's conformity assessment advisor. He delivered a keynote on the role of conformity assessment in CETs, and he specifically talked about some of the challenges with conformity assessment in artificial intelligence during that discussion. And then we also had some panel discussions, and actually Mary Saunders was on one of them on public-private partnerships to advance global standardization, and then another one on driving innovation through standardization that featured many NIST lab directors as well as some of their private sector partners. It was a great event. Like I said, there is a recording. Again, you can go to standards.gov to find more information on this event. I did want to briefly talk about the term pre-standardization. I've used it a few times today, and it is one of the pillars of the Standardization Center of Excellence, and it's used quite a bit in the implementation roadmap as well. So I wanted to kind of talk about what the term pre-standardization means. We talk about what this term means quite a bit at NIST, and it can mean many, many different things, everything from creating and maintaining standardization roadmaps by convening industry, government, academia, and other stakeholders. It could be purposeful convening to produce seed documents that lay the foundation for standardization. It may be facilitating broad representation in standards development by convening underrepresented groups. It could mean information sharing via briefing documents or web-based resources describing current activities in standardization. It could be assessing gaps or doing landscape scans that inform research needs. Could be engaging industry and relevant stakeholders to identify and prioritize standardization and measurement related needs. Or it could be directing research to meet or anticipate a specific standardization goal. So it's a pretty broad term. We use it quite a bit, but I kind of wanted to just provide a little bit of clarity for what it might mean in the context of this particular conversation. Some of the other activities that we have ongoing right now. So we are working on the Standards Excellence Recognition Prize Challenge. This effort will be to reward the people behind impactful standards development efforts. Look out for more information on that on standards.gov. We're working with a few other federal agencies on that effort, including EPA, USPTO, and the Department of Homeland Security. We also have a request for information that's open right now. I believe that RFI closes on December 10th. So please get your comments in soon if you have not already. The purpose of this RFI is to solicit feedback on implementation and information on existing standards recognition programs and the best practices for workforce development. One of the things that Dr. Lori Locasio, NIST director, has indicated is that it's really important for us to keep this conversation going with the private sector and the rest of the standards community. And that's what this RFI really is. We hope that there will be many more of these opportunities to provide feedback as we continue down the road of implementing the strategy. And so this is just the latest of what will hopefully be many, many ways that we will continue to communicate and facilitate broad discussion regarding standards participation and other issues of importance regarding the strategy. And then finally, we're also working on exploring a small business innovation research program. More information about that will be available on standards.gov as it comes to fruition as well. So with that, that's my last slide. So I just want to thank everybody. I don't know if we have any time for questions now, or if we'd like to move on to the next presenter. I'll let our facilitators guide that discussion, but thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Maria and Jayne, for this very impressive and from the European perspective, challenging program, what you have now on the table. I think here the European Commission and also the member states here should have a close look of what you're planning, and maybe we have 5 minutes until half to answer some questions. I have also already a list, but I think we can do that then towards the end. There was one question in the chat. At least somebody raised their hand. Is that still? Then maybe if is there somebody? I have a question. Since you said there are new objectives also for standardization, what is then maybe also the role of regulation and the link to regulation? What you might foresee in the future? Is that getting closer, like what we have in Europe, or is that still a separate playground?
Yeah, I'll attempt at answering that, but I don't see the current regulatory system changing. Currently within the US, standards are incorporated by reference into regulation. And I foresee that to continue to be the way that standards are used. However, INTA strategy does note the important need to coordinate between the private sector and US government in standards development, given the important role that standards do play in regulation. And I don't know, Jayne or Mary, if either of you'd like to add to that.
I'll just add first that it is an opportunity for the regulatory agencies to be very involved in this activity. And so I know that several of the regulatory agencies contributed extensively to the development of the implementation roadmap, and they're very engaged in delivering on the standard strategy and the implementation. So I think it's a robust conversation here in the United States, and because of working within the standards bodies, it does include many others and give the opportunity for many across the interest areas of these emerging technology sectors to engage and be a part of the conversation as far as informing regulation as well as the standards development.
Okay, thank you very much. I have more questions, but I would like to give Mary the floor because I do not want really to take some of her maybe topics from her plate. Therefore, Mary, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Knut. I'm very happy to be here to participate in this event on behalf of ANSI. Just a few words of brief introduction before I get into the topic that I plan to dive into, which is the geopolitics of the current standards environment. So ANSI has overseen the U.S. private sector-led standards and conformity assessment system for more than 100 years, working in close partnership with government, industry, and others to enhance global competitiveness of the U.S. and also to enhance the quality of life. We've seen, I think the Institute and the U.S. have seen a lot of changes over those 100 years, and I'll talk a little bit more about the current environment. But the Institute itself doesn't develop standards. We're not a STO. We provide a neutral forum for all directly and materially interested parties to participate in standards development. More than 240 ANSI accredited organizations develop standards that support all industry sectors. They address national and global priorities. They advance technology areas, including those that are deemed critical in emerging technology. And as I'm sure the audience is aware, many of these standards are used globally. And ANSI is also the official U.S. representative to two international standards organizations, ISO and IEC, the two non-treaty-based international standards bodies where much work is on CET standards and ICT standards is underway. In that role, we facilitate the access of U.S. experts, organizations, industry, government, and academia to these forums, and we work to assure that U.S. interests are considered and broadly adopted. A question that's come up on several occasions, at least here in the US, with the advent of the US government strategy and the discussions surrounding its implementation in the broader context of the US standards strategy, is can the standards system and standards policies keep pace with the current environment? And that's a question we think about a lot as ANSI, and I would say our determined response is a very clear yes, but I'd like to go into some of the general points about the standards landscape and some of the reasons why we feel that the standards system is robust and can address new challenges. So first, as I'm sure you're all aware, the global standards landscape is evolving at an increasing pace. The sheer number of standards activities and venues, places to develop those standards, has increased in the past decade, and work's ongoing in formal consensus bodies, national standards representation, ISO and IEC, technical expert representation, in other venues, in treaty organizations, in consortia, fora, and in the open standards and open source software space as well. For interoperability purposes, that's a very important aspect that I think industry pays a lot of attention to. And the pace of change in emerging technology areas is moving at an ever-increasing rate too. There is an ICT component in most of these emerging technology areas, which means that a variety of venues are relevant for standards development activities. It's not one particular venue depending on the technology and depending on the role of standards in advancing that technology. And as have been discussed briefly earlier, there are a larger number of global players, both government and private sector, that are actively engaged in standards processes too. So reflecting global competitiveness pressures, there's clear evidence of greater interest by national and regional governments in developing and maintaining what we call in the US a first mover advantage in emerging technology areas. In some instances, this takes the effect of limiting foreign participation in standards development activities. And you can see varying approaches to this across the various government standardization strategies and actual practice. Notwithstanding this, there's a broad array of standards venues that experts want to work in. And in some instances, government actions may make this more difficult from the private sector perspective. So what's the impact of technology competition on the standards environment? So the global environment we see is currently characterized by government-to-government competition for technology advantages. This is not new, but it's particularly intense in the current environment. And the competition is playing out in the standards space through different government policies and approaches, as I mentioned briefly. So from the private sector perspective, maintaining the integrity of standards process is of critical importance. Open, transparent, consensus-based procedures lead to the best technical standards. And if these defining principles are compromised, then the resulting standards may also be compromised. So there are a range of policies that impact the standards development environment. I just wanted to touch on three perspectives briefly. One type of policies are those that impact how standards are developed and used specifically. And quite frequently, you will see national security drivers as an impetus for these policies. I'll give you a couple of US examples and then a more general example. In the US, we do see increasing export controls on strategic technologies for particular national security purposes. And about 5 years ago now, we had a very early rule from our Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security that had an incidental impact on standards participation and the perception of the US as a trusted partner. That regulation has been since refined and revised, and it no longer entangles standards development activities with export controls and controlled technologies, but it had a significant impact on US participation in global standards and also on the US representation as a friendly and trusted partner. Another example are policies protecting networks and critical infrastructure, supply chains and competitiveness, clear national security drivers in those particular areas, which also have an incidental or direct impact on the standards that support those technologies. And then a final example is a policy focus on like-minded nations, which from a government-to-government perspective is certainly a rational approach. From the standards system perspective, I mentioned openness and transparency. The standards table is open to all, to technical experts from all countries and all walks of life. And it's important to keep the process open. The second bucket of policies are those that impact how technologies are developed and used and may have an incidental impact on standards. I think, Knut, one of your early questions touched on this, which are, how does it impact regulations? So there are government policies on AI, as an example, artificial intelligence, which is not one technology. It's a range of hardware and software implementations of different types. And in the US, as you're probably aware, we have not taken a comprehensive regulatory approach to dealing with artificial intelligence risks and opportunities, but are rather looking at the current regulatory structure and how risks are identified and dealt with within the current regulatory structure. And certainly the role of standards in supporting an informed regulatory approach, where standards can be a tool, which is what they are. They are a tool to support policies. It's important to remember that standards are tools. While they can provide practical support for policy implementation, they're not a replacement for policy. And I think we've seen some tensions across the globe in terms of different interpretations of the actual, what actually standards can accomplish. And I, for one, having been in this space for a long time, see there's a clear role for government decision-making when you have a policy approach, and standards are technical tools to help you achieve your chosen policy approach. And finally, there's a bucket of policies that call for development of standards-like deliverables by governments in certain situations. And these deliverables, specifications or high-level documents that haven't gone through the full consensus process and aren't open to all stakeholders can compete for attention with voluntary standards. And so we watch that from the private sector very closely. So government's a stakeholder in the standards arena, a very important stakeholder, but not a super stakeholder. There are many relevant stakeholder groups, as Jayne mentioned, some of which are new to standards and somewhat skeptical of their views being considered in standards development. So we are looking, certainly from the ANSI perspective, and I know NIST as well, as welcoming those new stakeholder groups and engaging them in the broader standards process, because that leads to a better technical outcome. And if I'm asked about a general overarching statement, it's very hard to generalize about the standards environment. Each standards venue, each organization is different, including differences in representation, who comes to the table, decision-making, and in membership. And it's important to remember the variety of venues and a variety of structures in the system, which I think is a strength. We think at ANSI it's a strength. The fact that the standards environment is not monolithic is important. There are multiple standards venues, each with different sets of policies and procedures. It's a feature of the system, as we like to say. It's not a bug. This is a positive aspect, not a problem that needs to be solved. And the fact that many experts participate in, or at least familiar with, a variety of standards organizations and communicate across venues can make it more difficult for any actor to game the system. And we've had these discussions about particular actors trying to game a particular standards organization or a standards system. So like standards venues, critical and emerging technologies, and ICT, they're also different, and standards are relevant at different times in the technology lifecycle. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Standards for some technologies are leading edge indicators. So the standards need to be there as a platform for technology commercialization. For other technologies, standards are lagging edge. And I think that's an important difference to remember too, in terms of engagement in various standards activities. In all cases, early dialogue amongst policymakers and the standards community in a particular technology area is very important, early dialogue, so that the standards community is aware of and can understand policy drivers and needs in the current environment. And the diverse interests and relevant standards venues also point to the need for information sharing on an ongoing basis. I know these are two aspects that NIST is looking at, as well as other government agencies, and certainly will be at least part of the focus of the Standardization Center of Excellence, information sharing and early public-private collaboration and cooperation. I'll just close with 3 points, and I look forward to discussion on these. One is it's important to educate and raise awareness on how to effectively leverage standards, noting that they should not be used as what we call a compete tool for governments. They are intended to be a technical support for various government approaches. It's also important to work collaboratively with policymakers to assure that solutions to address shortcomings are directed to specific organizations where there are genuine issues that have not or cannot be resolved. And keep in mind that most of those organizations are private sector organizations, and they are private sector led, and governance procedures should be addressed working through the process. And finally, I think we're all aware that it's important to assure that standards organizations safeguards, by that I mean the procedures, their policies, their controls, are continually reviewed and pressure tested so that they remain fit for purpose. But I think, as I said at the beginning of my comments, in answer to the question is, can the standardization system survive and accurately and actively address the challenges of the current standards environment and the geopolitical environment? I think we've already seen evidence that it can, and certainly look forward to a continued discussion about that. So that's those are some of my comments.
Thank you very much, Mary, for giving the perspective from ANSI, complementing what Maria and Jayne kind of presented from the NIST perspective. Before Justus comes into play, maybe I can ask you one question. You said that yeah, there's more competition to be expected or already going on because new players are entering the field. On the other hand, we have the consensus principle at the ISO level. Do you see problems to achieve this consensus in the future? Or is it becoming more kind of complicated, also making the processes lengthy or even fail?
So that's a great question. And I think, again, there's not one overarching answer to that, but I think we've seen through experience in some of the emerging technology areas. And I'm going to go back 9-10 years to nanotechnology, which is not emerging, but in a standardization sense, it was about 10 years ago. And coming early to the table in ISO, in this case, to develop standards for nanotechnology, not much progress was made for about 6 years because it was very early, and there was a lot of sort of coalescing and forming of what should be standardized and how should it be addressed. And that is an example of what I think I mentioned in the technology space, that in some technology spaces, standards are a leading edge, in some cases they're a lagging edge. I think we're seeing the same thing now in quantum, with the formation of a new Joint Technical Committee 3 of ISO and IEC, and the difficulty and the need to coalesce around what exactly should be standardized when and what are the priorities. Those are two technology examples. I also think there are examples where there are difficult or more complex issues that have arisen in standardization that do need to engage these new stakeholder groups, civil society, human rights experts, philosophers, many others that have not been engaged in technology standards and need to understand how this process works and how their views can be engaged. So these are much more complicated issues than a strict interoperability of a hardware or a firmware system. And that's something we need to take into account as well.
Okay. Means it will not getting easier, getting more complicated. Okay, but we will come back later when we have some time for further discussion. And there's one question in the Q&A section, if you might have a look at that. I think this is addressing you in the US, and maybe you can answer this. Therefore, finally, Justus, the floor is yours. Maybe a complementary academic view on the things in the US.
So can you hear me now also?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. And see the slides as well?
Can you change into presentation mode?
Yes, I can.
Please.
Okay, excellent. Okay. So
yeah,
thank you very much for inviting me and for the opportunity to speak on this panel. So I'm truly humbled to be here together with leading practitioners, experts, insiders of the US standardization system. So I have a much more humble position here. I think that I'm My potential contribution to this panel is primarily that I collected some data on US leadership or leadership in general in different ICT standards bodies for an academic paper 3 to 4 years ago. And that has led to several reflections on some of these geopolitical elements of the discussion in standardization policy. And today I would primarily like to use my prerogative as the one academic on the panel to give just a little bit of a broader perspective on some of these topics in light of some of the evidence that we have collected. So basically, just as one step back first, what the geopolitics or the geopolitical dimension, that is a very broad term that could involve many different dimensions. So I've listed at least 6 dimensions that immediately come to mind. So I think the primary or the most straightforward international dimension of technology standards is that technology standards are a tool to support international trade. But then obviously, when different countries harmonize standards, that always raises the question, who gets to dominate or who gets to lead in the development of these international standards. So this is often related to questions of industrial policy, countries trying to promote their own interests, their own stakeholders in the development of these standards. Where standards have not only commercial, but also societal implications. There's an interface with regulation, there's an interface with societal considerations and stakeholders. International standards bodies have been described as co-regulatory actors in transnational co-regulation. So this is obviously extremely important in the context of standardization in fields such as AI. Sorry for my voice, I'm a little bit sick, so I'm doing my best. So then finally, in the US, as was already said, the notion of geopolitics or geopolitical implications that has really come to the forefront is the national security angle. So the various interfaces between technology standards development and national security concerns, national security interests. Which is multifaceted as well. So standards can support national security interests, but there can also be risks specific to threats in the standardization process, for example, from adversaries interfering with the regular standards development process. And finally, and what I think is emerging as the most robust narrative, the most robust dimension is just international standards as one arena of a broader global competition, which is not necessarily the one powerful angle for everything, but it's one arena where these dynamics play out. So one word on the general US standardization system. I think most people know this, but I mean, this is a very private-led standardization system, which primarily just consists of hundreds of standards development organizations and consortia that develop standards in all kinds of different fields. ANSI is, of course, an important coordinator in that private system, carries out many important roles, maintains ANSI essential requirements, which are the basis for the accreditation of American standards developers and the approval of American national standards. It's also the US member body to ISO and IEC, accredits technical advisory groups that collect and represent national consensus of the US in international standards development, and leads periodic updates of the US standardization strategy, which is a kind of a broad multi-stakeholder document reflecting policy principles and goals of the US. Government involvement in standards development is important and significant, but is not overstepping the private lead. It is also very primarily, it's driven by many different actors. All kinds of different agencies may use private standards and may participate in the development of industry standards. These involvements or use of industry standards are subject to very general policies. So some of these documents, the National Technology Transfer Advancement Act of 1995, the OMB Circular A119, the latest version of which is from 2016, the Standard Development of Organization Advancement Act of 2005. These are very general policy statements on expected principles of standards development, expected characteristics of industry standards that make them fit for certain uses of government, or in the case of SDOIA, that justify why standards development processes would benefit from antitrust liability protections. So this is basically a very flexible, a very general standards policy framework compared to other regions where there's a much more specific interface between government and industry standards. But of course, we have NIST as an important coordinating agency that coordinates the role and functions of various agencies, and is also in, as we have heard, in this kind of the natural dialogue partner for ANSI from the government side. What I think is the primary background, what's really kind of the elephant in the room of all these evolutions that we have heard about over the last 5 to 7 years probably, is a conversation that is under the impression of US competition with China, primarily technology competition in critical and emerging technologies, where there is a perception that US leadership is being challenged, and that losing US leadership in these critical and emerging technologies would have adverse consequences, including consequences to the national security of the United States. And in this general debate, there have been various initiatives which took different shapes under the first Trump and the Biden administration. There were more direct, I would say, more direct efforts to intervene in certain processes under the Trump administration, and also certain legislative initiatives. So here I'm listing just 2 proposed bills, Senate bills that did not move out of committee. So these are failed legislative initiatives, but that are representative of a broader policy push to encourage the US government to take a more proactive approach in order to deal with these real or perceived challenges to US leadership, including by directly identifying through, for example, interagency working groups, way to promote how US individuals and companies can take leadership positions in international standards development, or by codifying certain principles, due process principles, that the US government believes private standards organizations should have. So these failed legislative initiatives paved the way for, or opened the door for the developments that we have heard about today, which are executive actions, which are coming from the executive branch of government, and which I would describe as more incremental, not because they're less important, but because they are much more in line or in continuity of already existing characteristics of the standardization system. So we have the National Standards Strategy for Critical and Emerging Technology, but we also have the Executive Order on Safe, Secure, and Trustworthy Artificial Intelligence, which talks a lot about standards, and one deliverable of the follow-up to that executive order is a plan for global engagement on AI standards from this year. We also have recently, for example, the National Security Administration and Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency together making recommendations for increasing US participation and leadership in standards development, always in this context of a push for promoting US national security interests through continued US leadership in the development of international standards. So this is something that you can find in all these documents, the statement of the importance of leadership, US leadership in international standards for national security concerns and interests of the United States. But where they depart from these previous initiatives is that they do not necessarily propose direct changes to how these standards development processes would operate or should operate. And so What I wanted to do now is to just briefly comment on the background to this by showing you some of the data that we have collected in our academic paper, give then a little bit of an update to that, which is then basically the basis for some considerations on where we are now and where I see room for further clarifications. So what we have done in this paper, we just collected data on participation in what we believe are some of the most salient, most important standards development organizations in the field of ICT, and try to classify individuals by the region of residence where they currently live, which obviously is a very imperfect indicator of geographic power balances, but this is also one point that I want to get to later. I mean, these notions are inherently problematic. It's not that easy to define what actually is a US leadership. Anyway, so here we can see that there is robust US participation in all these different bodies, which is unsurprising. You can also see that both European and US participation, the share of European and US participation in most of these bodies has somewhat declined over the years, but this is merely testament to the increasing diversity of the participants in these bodies. So there are the participants from a wider array of nations. So there's, if you look at the geographic distribution of the participation in these bodies at the end of the period, it's much more diverse and with much greater participation from Asia, but also what we have labeled the rest of the world than in the beginning of the period. And if you look at a similar evolution, but you focus, instead of focusing on the general population of attendees, you focus on individuals holding some kind of leadership position in these processes. Here we look at the working group chairs. What we see is that these US and also European participants, they are even more strongly represented in these higher leadership positions than they are in the general population of attendants. So there's it's not clear that there's much of a risk that there would be a general displacement of European and US stakeholders and individuals in these leadership positions, even though we of course see also here that there is some appearance of participation from other countries and continents. Where I believe the data is a little bit more supportive, or where we can a little bit better understand the origin of this nervosity about challenges to leadership in standards development, is at the level of affiliations. So here we see that across these different 4 bodies that we have studied, we see that European and US companies have ceded the top position to Huawei, which is had become, since as of 2020, the leading affiliation of participants in all these different bodies. And similar to other multinational companies, Huawei has also is overrepresented in leadership positions such as chairs compared to smaller entities. But our paper, what we then really contributed, I believe, is an analysis of how these individuals actually reach these leadership positions, where we found that the primary predictors for whether an individual is appointed to a leadership position in standards development is not the affiliation that they work for. It's definitely not the country where they come from, but it's individual experience, expertise. So this is, first of all, it's a sign of the health of the ecosystem, which contradicts a little bit this narrative that individuals go to standards development in order to push a national or a commercial interest. But it also is a little bit an indication that there is a resilience built into the system, which comes from the fact that this is a community of technical experts, where technical experts care about how other experts in that community perceive them, which also might be one of the reasons why the system has been resilient and robust to geopolitical tensions. So this is dated, and so just for the purpose of today, I try to get a little bit more recent data. But overall, the message doesn't really fundamentally change. So here we have chair appointments in 3GPP over the recent years. So we do see that Huawei gets a fair share of these chair appointments in the recent years. So there's continued increase of Huawei in leadership of working groups at 3GPP. Less clear or not clear at all at the vice chair level. So here there's much broader diversity, and Huawei actually did not get any of these over the last years. At IETF, we see that US participation in the attendance population continues pretty much at the same level. Chinese participation, if anything, is actually going down again after having increased significantly. And if we compare shares of US or Chinese individuals among the attendance population with their share in the chair population, we see that US individuals continue to be overrepresented in leading positions in the standards development. So overall, it's a little bit of a message that the US continues to enjoy a robust position in these international standards development efforts. The increase of Chinese participation, and in particular Huawei participation, of course, is real, but it has not continued to rise at an unabated pace. So like it kind of has stabilized at some point. And it's not clear that this leading position that European and US individuals and companies have, with the exception of Huawei, is fundamentally being challenged. Anyway, so I wanted to get back to these topics that I initially said are kind of the dimensions under which to analyze the international or geopolitical dimension of standards, and reflect a little bit on that in light of what we've seen. So technology standards and international trade. So this has been historically the primary driver for the development of a US standards policy. We know that standards harmonization is tremendously important for promoting international trade. It is reflected in the US policy so the NTTAA invites agencies to consider international standards, which transposes TBT, principles of giving preference to international standards. Now, of course, the new question that is a little bit the elephant in the room is whether we are entering a new age of protectionism. So the TBT came from the idea that we had gotten rid of tariffs. So now the remaining barriers to trade are non-tariff barriers. Now we know that tariffs are back in the picture and are globally increasing again. So the question is whether we will also see diminished appetite to further reduce trade barriers on the technical side. And one area, at least, where I believe that could make sense is this principle of reciprocity. So we know that it's not very appealing to reduce trade barriers to foreign trade partners if they don't do the same on their side. So this obviously is also applicable to standards. So there has been some frustration, for example, with other trade partners' use of standards as tool of industrial policy, basically not allowing foreign products, US products into the Chinese market, for example, or only under conditions, for example, forfeiting intellectual property rights that are unacceptable to US companies and interests. Nevertheless, so far, at least, there's no evidence that there's international fragmentation in international technology standards. Those examples where there could be most concrete concerns, such as, for example, this idea of a new internet protocol that would compete with IETFs, have not gained traction so far. I have to move a bit faster through my slides, but I mean, the second idea is this idea of technology standards as tool for industrial policy. So there's this saying that third-class companies make products, second-class companies invent, and first-class companies create standards. So we know that certain US companies have really epitomized this idea. For example, in the cellular space, we have companies such as Qualcomm and InterDigital, whose technological leadership is strongly associated with leadership in standards development. In IETF, the same can be said of companies such as Cisco and Juniper. Intel and IBM, it's a little bit more complicated. I mean, these are companies that are not associated with any particular SDO standards primarily, but they are. We have the database, the Searle Center database of membership in standards organizations, and they are our two top entities that participate in standards organizations in ICT across the world, at least as of the latest count. But the more recent technological success stories of the US are a little bit more difficult. So the Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, but also the NVIDIA, Tesla, OpenAI, none of these companies is really strongly associated with technology standards in the SDO sense. They are not leading contributors or participants in our data in terms of participation in formal or consortium standards development. So it's not that clear cut that the current US technology and industry leadership in emerging technologies is really based on their company's leadership in technology standards. With respect to standards as tools for co-regulation, this is really the angle through which this entire geopolitical topic is approached in Europe. So we have this notion of technological sovereignty. It's important that it's EU stakeholders that decide on EU standards. This is much less prominent in the United States, where there can be multiple reasons for that. In particular, the US does not have a standardization system formally established that could be compared to the EU system, where there are officially recognized standards bodies that carry out a clearly defined co-regulatory role. So it's a much more flexible private sector-driven system. There also is less emphasis on societal balance or representation of social categories, as it's called in Europe. So I believe overall the US policy approach is more comfortable with the private and industrial nature of technology standards than the European one, even though it's worth noting that traditionally, historically in the United States, social balance was seen to be more important for safety standards and for product standards. So this might be relevant for AI standards, which are, at least at the current stage, primarily safety standards. And finally, one other reason to add is that US companies obviously enjoy a much stronger position in many of these technologies. So in the EU, much of this nervosity about AI and related recent technologies comes from the fact that these are non-EU stakeholders primarily dictating technological advances, and so it's a matter of national sovereignty to be able to regulate these technologies. Where in the US, it's primarily a relationship between US government and US companies. Now, this national security angle, this has been really the primary angle, as I said, in the United States. So there was this concern of improper foreign actor influence on security sensitive technology standards. There has been some anecdotal evidence of international standards being tainted by suspicions of something like this, which might justify this idea that it's really important to preserve US leadership so that we can keep these adversaries out, basically denying leadership for foreign adversaries by keeping the leadership positions in US hands. But overall, there's no strong evidence to back up concern over risk of any dominance by adversaries of the United States. At least no major ICT standards bodies is at risk of being dominated. And overall, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that these bodies have shown resilience and that there's good reasons to trust the system, including in the wake of these tensions. But as we have also heard, there's repercussions of some of these national security concerns that are not necessarily centered on standards, but that play out on standards. So we have a placement of different technology companies on entity lists, which has made it more difficult for US companies to collaborate with these entities in standards development. So there has been clarifications that make it easier to collaborate on standards development, but I mean, the boundaries of these clarifications are still problematic. And of course, we know that the leadership in standards development is really often a consequence of being embedded in a closed network of collaborative relationships with other companies. So even if collaboration within standards development is fine, limitations on collaborations in general are still problematic for US leadership. Anyway, what I think really is is showing in the documents that NIST and ANSI have shown to us today is this broader standards national security nexus. Is basically the idea that holding leadership in critical industries and technologies is a national security imperative, that leadership in technology standards is helpful for that. And it also has an added benefit of preserving attributes and characteristics of the standards setting system that are seen as socially desirable. And that in order to promote this technology leadership and promote this leadership in technology standards, the US government policy should be supportive, but not override the private sector's lead. So this is, I believe, reflected in these government documents that have been developed over the last years. And there's relatively little debate from my side with the gist of this. It's just a question or just one comment. I mean, these basically, there's a huge degree of overlap between the stated preferences and objectives of these documents with things that were already desired policy objectives and preferences before that. So it's not clear that this national security global leadership angle really adds a new policy angle or a new policy approach. Finally, just for the panelists, some questions to explore. What does really standards leadership mean? What actually is pursued when we pursue US leadership? Does it mean that we want US actors to hold leadership positions, or do we want international standards to incorporate US technology, or is it enough that the US objectives and concerns and interests are reflected in international standards, no matter who produces them? The same is with respect to leadership by whom. Is it important that it's US companies, US individuals, US government, or simply actors that are broadly aligned with US strategic interests? So I think these are questions that remain underdefined a little bit to this date. And one important concern that is closer to my heart is also we have very limited and very bad, poor metrics of standards leadership that also lead to erroneous conclusions. If we just count things such as attendance or patents or contributions, we might get the wrong impression of who's actually leading, and this leads also to wrong policy choices. So I will leave you on this, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Justus. Very, very comprehensive and also quite interesting to get a little bit kind of evidence on what's really going on, leaving us with this 3 open questions at the end. But now I'd like to give first the ladies the floor, maybe to ask questions to you, whether there are questions to you, Justus' assessment, whether you see it different. Before I come up with my questions for the remaining 15 minutes. Has somebody? Maria?
So, what's the question? Or are you asking us just to comment on?
Do you have questions regarding Justus' presentation, or do you kind of completely agree what he kind of assessed regarding the US situation?
I think they're very interesting observations. It is duly noted that collecting data regarding standards participation is extremely difficult, very challenging to do something like that. And you're right, we don't always have the numbers to support some of the, I mean, I'll call them assumptions that are being made regarding the influence in the standards system. So I think it's important that we figure out how and if we can collect some of that data. And I think some of that is pointed out in the roadmap for the implementation of the US government national strategy as well. And it's pointed out as a challenge. So I'll comment on that. Jayne, do you have anything to add?
I just really appreciate the presentation and the observations, and very intrigued by the publications, and we'll go review them. I think one of your points about there not being a change in policy, I agree with that 100%. All of the work around the implementation had been clearly articulated to be a doubling down on US policy. So the leadership by the private sector is clearly has clearly served the United States very well for a long time, and That was always the intent of the implementation. And just from my historical engagement, I can reference that. I think in terms of your questions and really thinking more strategically, one of the things that came clear to me in this process of engaging more in the policy behind standards development versus the standards development activities themselves, I think one of the challenges that was very clear is that we don't have a good system of metrics for the health of the standard system at large. It's challenging to measure how healthy the engagement from any one country is. All countries are struggling to figure out how to do that. And I think the diversity of standards development organizations, that shouldn't change. That should be one of the metrics. It's just the places that we go to engage in standards development, rather than reducing that, really thinking more holistically about what that means for the health of the system and our ability to evolve standards engagement, the needed sort of landscape or roadmap views of what standards are needed for emerging technology, and making sure that we have the venues to engage and can better communicate those venues. That seems to me to be a really helpful way of sharing more information. I know that was something that we heard for especially small and medium-sized companies where they don't have a lot of resources to effectively track all of the standards activities. If there are ways of communicating where to go, that may help. But as far as a broad suite of metrics, I don't think that we have those. And I think that's a really interesting point that you raised in your questions.
Thank you, Jayne. Maybe in addition to what Justus said, what we did, we looked for ISO standards at the scientific references and introduced the concept of so-called standard relevant publications, which underline that the US is still the major contributor to ISO standards. That means here we do not see yet China at the same level as standard essential patents. They are still way beyond that. That means also the approach of NIST, closer linking research and standardization, especially in these critical emerging technologies. I think this is going to help to continue the strengths of the US regarding influencing ISO standards from the content perspective, because also here Germany, for example, is on number 2 or 3, depending how you count it, with UK. That means we see here a European dominance, which is not the case for the ICT world, where we have major Chinese player. Therefore, again, what has been said before, also the measures and the metrics have to be context specific. That means in the ICT world, it's different, and in the ICT world, also a new phenomena might be important is the world of open source contributions complementing standards or competing standards. That's just a remark from my side. So does anyone jump on this metric thing? Otherwise, I have 2 or 3 questions. Maria and Jayne, you talked about perceived and real barriers in your presentation. Could you just provide some examples? What are the major topics which popped up in this consultation or this open consultation regarding this barrier aspect?
Yeah, hold on one second. Let me open my cheat sheet here. So in terms of the barriers, specifically some of the things that were noted were reduced visa wait times and making sure that people can actually plan ahead and get to a standards meeting in the US and know that they'll be able to actually participate. Identify and eliminating knowledge gaps between US policymakers and technical program leaders. So making sure that the people who make the policy and those who understand the technology are communicating and understand each other. Enhancing government participation where government is a member, for example, in ITU. And then facilitating engagement by providing standards information, education, and to raise awareness among underrepresented stakeholders. So those are the barriers specifically that were called out. I don't know if Jayne, you can elaborate any more on some of the things that you heard.
I think my prior comment about knowing where to go, that was something that we heard over and over again and consistently hear from colleagues in academia and small companies. It's such an investment, and sustaining engagement. You don't just go to a standards body, publish a standard and walk away. It's a commitment to a community, and I think that was in Justus' comments as well. Your work is part of a broader body of work to advance technical underpinnings for a given technology area. So it requires that sustained investment. I think that can be very intimidating for organizations and individuals that don't have the resources to sustain that. So we heard a lot from community members that what the government in the United States could do would possibly be to help eliminate some of that or reduce those financial burdens, make it easier to know where to engage and how frequently, and then articulating what that commitment is for senior leadership in all organizations. It was really surprising. I remember hearing from a colleague in industry very early that standards engagement was not as valuable to and perceived as valuable to their organization. And so that was really part of the incentive to look at how recognition for standards could be more broadly presented to leadership at industry and government and academia, so that sustained investment is there for individuals and investment from their own leadership, that this is a commitment and it's very valuable to their institution that they engage. I think we can do a lot there just by sharing more about the impact, and work like what's here in the chat is really important to furthering that as well.
Thank you, Jayne. Justus, you want to answer some of the questions in the chat?
Yes, I mean, I maybe before I do that, if I could also comment on these barriers to participation, because there's much more recent work that I've done together with a co-author on international travel to participate in standardization meetings. And so we have a couple of interesting findings that I think are relevant here. So for one, we find that the role of geographic distance over time has become less prominent. People are willing to travel further to participate in meetings, but the role of international borders has not. So in particular, we see that there is reluctance or seemingly reluctance from Chinese participants to travel to the US and vice versa. So we see that if a meeting takes place in China, there's fewer US participants attending and vice versa. So I'm not convinced that this is a visa problem, but I think it's definitely worth exploring what's really behind this and maybe addressing some of the concerns. Also, I think what also the IETF graphs that I showed have shown is that over the last years, it has become a lot more bumpier. So since COVID, really it depends a lot more on where the meeting is held, whether people attend or not, than it used to be the case. So definitely there are barriers, and these barriers are not getting less important. Rather, over the last 3 or 4 years, we really see that the border effects are pretty strong and growing. And with respect to these comments, on the metrics, I don't have the silver bullet for you. Here is the metric that the US government should use. It's more like a comment saying that if it's such a strong and pervasive notion that motivates all these different government initiatives, then maybe it's something to reflect upon and maybe to develop a little bit further. What exactly is leadership? What type of leadership? What is the dimension of leadership that is being pursued? And how would you assess whether these policies are effective? And so for that, you would kind of expect that there's a little bit more of a impact assessment kind of approach in terms of, okay, this is what we want to pursue, this is what we want to promote, and here's how we measure whether our policies are achieving this. Yes, I mean, I see other bodies being suggested to be included. I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's absolutely no pretension of being comprehensive here. I mean, this is a convenient sample that is based on the data that I had because of an outgrowth of other projects, and so I don't pretend to have covered the entire world of ICT standardization, which of course would be impossible. So this is in response.
Thank you. Maybe last round, because there's a question we see in the chat and which we kind of maneuvered around is, yeah, what will be the implication of the outcome of the elections on your plans, and also from my personal perspective, where do you see your opportunities for collaboration with Europe and EU under this new kind of framework conditions?
So, you know, the new administration has not started yet, so we don't have clear guidance at this point. However, I expect that the U.S. government national standards strategy work will continue. Standards have been a bipartisan issue in the past, and I expect that they will be moving forward. So we will continue on with our work. In terms of, you know, relationships with the EU and how we work with them, again, we haven't had direct guidance from the new administration yet, and so it's hard to speak to that at this point, and we'll have to wait and see how those things go and how they develop. So it's a bit of a non-answer, but probably the best I can do at this point.
Okay, that means we have to rejoin. The other lady, Mary, you want to give a guess? Or?
No, I support what Maria had said. It's very early to tell, since it's, as she said, the new administration is not in place yet. I will just a point about the leadership issue, which we've discussed, you know, over the past year or so, and I appreciate Justus and other people's comments about what are we counting and why are we counting? What does it really mean? I will say, you know, when talking to private sector constituencies and even government constituencies, but particularly the private sector, it's more about the output. It's the resulting standard, and is it technically robust, and does it reflect, you know, a true consensus? And yes, does it reflect U.S. technical inputs? I know a lot of folks will tell you that historically U.S. interests have not wanted to claim leadership because a consensus is not a leadership activity. I think we're looking at contributions and welcoming others into the consensus. So if it looks like it's somebody else's idea, that's fine. There's a little bit of a risk to claiming leadership because then others want to compete and on what metric are we talking about? We don't want a competition for leadership. We want a competition for the best outcome or output in terms of standards. So it's a little bit of a dicey situation. And then one other brief point is that for any constituency, but particularly the new stakeholders, it's what is the value proposition? I can easily tell you what the value proposition is for corporate staff to participate in standards activities. It's their bottom line and being, you know, having conversations with their competitors. Even for government agencies, I can give you a pretty good sense of what the value proposition is, at least from the US perspective. But what's the value proposition for consumers, for civil society? We need to more carefully articulate why it's important that they come to the table, and more to the point, what do they gain from being at the table? And that's a challenge.
Okay. Thank you. Jayne, one last comment from your side? No?
I just think Mary's remarks are really spot on, really working at that value proposition with academia and civil society and the public more broadly. There is a lot of interest, especially in emerging technologies that are going to impact all of society. So there's just a growing interest in engaging, and we have a lot of education to do to share how to effectively engage in standards. It's a lot of work for all of us.
Yeah, thank you. And regarding education, we have this European project on ISO for standards, which is also addressing these issues of values, European interest, which is mirroring a little bit the US kind of objective. And therefore, I think maybe this was a little bit premature on the one hand. On the other hand, I think was a a good exchange on, at least from a European perspective, what's going on and what has been planned in the US, and we have to see how the new administration will impact on your plans, and therefore I think we should certainly rejoin next year when maybe you have a clear picture what's going to happen, what's possible, and align with kind of what Europe has. Also, we have a new commission since yesterday, more or less, which will also have implications for some standards-related strategies, activities. There's the evaluation of the regulation 1025. There's a staff working document under preparation, which will be also out probably early 2025. Therefore, some new documents will be on the table, which we should take then as an opportunity to rejoin, and then maybe to discuss a little bit more in detail where we can really then form alliances of mutual interest in order to make sure that Europe and US are not really then falling on leadership of others in standardization. And I think that's maybe an outlook for the next US-EU webinar, maybe also to have some EU Commission representatives here at the table to have an exchange on a little bit a different level. But with saying this, and also expecting that especially some Europeans will drop out soon, thank you very much for your very insightful presentations of the strategies, of the planned activities, of the current situations, but also of the challenges. And now I think we have a little more clear picture what you have planned, and maybe we can mirror that soon with what is on the table from the European perspective to maybe to find a consensus despite the ambition of having leadership here and there. Thank you. Have a good day. Have a nice evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
25. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.